Bienvenue au colloque Perlé en archipel improbable après 2 reports, bilingue. Représenter le sexe féminin, imagé imaginaire, uncovering the female sexual anatomy, depictions and discourses. Je suis Hélène Caz, je suis professeure à l'Université de Victoria. Cette séance ne sera pas traduite. I'm Hélène Caz, I'm a professor at the University of Victoria. This session will not be simultaneously translated. So please, if you have questions, ask them in the chat. Sainte Ginette Miranda will address the questions, and she will also make a summary for us for debates. Je vous demande d'abord de pardonner mon anglais. Please forgive my French when I speak English. Je pense que le mieux est que je passe la parole à Chantal Barin, qui est attachée scientifique au Consulat général de France à Vancouver. Ça me fait très plaisir que Chantal Barin soit parmi nous et surtout, il me fait très plaisir de remercier le consulat de façon très officielle et en premier. Après, vous verrez, il y a de longues listes de remerciements et cette session en comportera beaucoup, perlé. Le consulat nous a en fait permis de proposer la traduction simultanée de toutes les conférences qui seront données, donc les 3 qui vont suivre, ces 3 jours qui viennent, et la dernière, le 7 juin. Donc sans plus attendre, je passe la parole à Chantal et je change ma présentation. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup, Hélène. Alors, j'ai préparé le topo en anglais parce que je ne savais pas quelle était
Non mais
exactement l'audience.
parfait.
Et je me suis dit que ça me ferait à moi aussi un bon entraînement pour parler anglais parce que, comme tu l'as souligné, en tant que français francophone, c'est une langue qu'il nous faut apprendre à apprivoiser quand on arrive en milieu anglophone. Donc, chère Hélène, dear all, as a representative of the scientific service at the Embassy of France, I am delighted to be here with you today to open your discussions on a subject, the female anatomy, which, as you will underline during these days, has fascinated humanity for millennia, either because it was hidden or because it was displayed. Yes, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes. So, so I start again to say to you all that as a representative of the scientific service, I'm really delighted to be here with you to open your discussions on the subject, the female anatomy, which, as you will underline during these days, has fascinated humanity for millennia, either because it was hidden or because it was displayed. Your conference challenges the training I received as a scientist during my studies in medical and pharmaceutical sciences. Indeed, even for future health professionals, the lessons of anatomy and physiology remained focused on the sole reproductive function, uterus, vagina, ovary, menstrual cycle, pregnancy, but leave aside the function of an organ solely dedicated to pleasure, the clitoris, which was never mentioned in any of the classes. However, this is not out of ignorance, because this small organ has been known to anatomists for a long time. So why not talk about it? Why so many mysteries? There will certainly not be enough of this conference to attempt to analyze the reasons for this, which probably are rooted in ancestral cultures. Indeed, the female anatomy, beyond the reproductive organ, is a symbolic representation of female identity and freedom, and many still want to abolish or at least limit it. Thanks to the convergence of ideas and movements aimed at repositioning women in society, a precise anatomical description of the clitoris was finally brought to light in the 2000s thanks to its 3D modeling. those described and presented to the greatest number, it reminds us that women are women and must exist as such. As a woman myself, I will listen with interest to the sociological interpretations that can be made of the evolution of representations of this female anatomy from the earliest texts or images to the present day. Because yes, even today, the female sex is scary. In too many places in the world, following ancestral traditions, it is sliced, it is soon, thus depriving women of the right to the pleasure that nature has conferred on them. But in our societies too, the female anatomy remains partly taboo. When will there be a free and open sex education? Wouldn't it partly prevent the spread of pornographic images that the youngest initially view out of curiosity, like any prohibited or shameful subject? May this academic reflection that you carry today clear the air around a subject that remains a problem when it is just about nature. I wish you excellent discussions, and I take the opportunity to deeply congratulate you, Helen, on this initiative. I think everyone here will be able to recognize and honor your passion of teaching and sharing knowledge, as well as the dynamism you have shown in leading your Perfecta students and organizing this conference with them. I wish you an excellent colloquium.
Well, thank you very much, Chantal. Merci beaucoup. I would like to take this opportunity to thank again the Consulat Général de France à Vancouver for your support, for the translations, but also for your words of encouragement. Je voudrais aussi remercier l'Université de Victoria, ma faculté, mon département et surtout mes bibliothèques, les services informatiques de la bibliothèque, le service Digital Scholarship, Digital Commons, le laboratoire ETCL, Electronic Textual Cultures, pour ces nombreux stages en Open Knowledge Practicum et pour sa patience aussi, et les presses de la bibliothèque qui feront de ce colloque un gros livre. En anglais, on dit un coffee table book, un gros livre avec de très belles images imprimées et un livre en ligne. Sans plus attendre, je propose que nous passions aux présentations de ce matin. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Sanghees, Esquimalt and Wasnik peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Et je vais continuer par un trigger warning, un avertissement. Vous allez voir de la nudité, un shamelessness, sexual content et aussi language, puisque les sujets sur lesquels l'équipe de recherche Perfecta travaille depuis 2018 tournent autour de la représentation du sexe féminin, de ses images et de ses mots. Nous avons une étiquette pour nos conférences. Je vous la résume en une image. Disons-nous bonjour et regardons-nous, parlons avec notre micro et notre caméra allumée. Pendant les conférences et pendant les performances artistiques, éteignons notre micro, éteignons notre caméra. Demain, et Sainte Ginette vous l'expliquera encore, demain, les conférences seront interprétées, c'est-à-dire traduites simultanément. Pour accéder à ce service, vous devrez cliquer sur cette petite icône. Ensuite, vous choisissez entre anglais et français, et puis tout va bien. Il vous suffit après de cliquer sur French ou sur English pour entendre le son de la délicieuse voix de Ginette ou de la voix envoûtante d'Emmanuel Eric, nos deux interprètes. J'en profite pour les remercier tous les deux. Sans eux, l'aventure serait moins aventureuse. et surtout pour vous, l'expérience serait moins intéressante. Enfin, pendant les tables rondes, gardons notre, gardons notre micro et notre caméra allumée, sauf lorsque quelqu'un parle. Oups là, pardon. Heu, je voudrais faire une courte présentation, à partir d'une phrase de Jean Liébaud qui traduit un médecin italien en 1582 et donne comme titre au premier chapitre d'un traité intitulé «Les 3 livres appartenant aux infirmités et maladies des femmes», la phrase suivante: «Que la femme n'est animent mutile ni imparfait». C'est une phrase qui, m'a frappée. D'abord parce que, contre toute attente, générale, c'est une idée neuve en Europe en 1582 de dire que la femme n'est pas un animal incomplet, ni un animal inaccompli. Heu, c'est en essayant de comprendre cette phrase qu'est né le projet Perfecta. L'idée que le corps féminin ne serait pas un corps défectueux arrive en même temps que d'autres grandes idées, qui maintenant, pour nous, forment la Renaissance. Le livre imprimé, la persuasion en Europe de découvrir l'Amérique, mais aussi la discorde religieuse et la querelle des femmes. C'est une idée qui vient d'échanges avec d'autres cultures et en particulier du point de vue médical avec les textes médicaux arabes et persans, qui vient de changements. On se marie plus tard en Europe au XVIe siècle qu'avant. On a survécu à la peste noire et surtout une idée qui vient de questions. Le premier à poser la question nouvelle de l'anatomie féminine, à savoir peut-on faire l'anatomie d'un corps qui est jusque-là resté sans queue ni tête, est un anatomiste, Jacopo Berengario da Carpi, et c'est un théoricien du regard scientifique surtout. Regard de l'observation par l'autopsie, c'est-à-dire non pas l'autopsie comme nous le voyons maintenant si nous regardons des séries télévisées, policières, mais le fait de regarder par soi-même ce que l'on décrit et non pas de le recopier d'ailleurs. Donc ce lieu aveugle du corps, découvert, et je mets, des guillemets autour de l'adjectif, par, les anatomistes vers la fin du XVe siècle, n'est évidemment pas, ignoré avant, mais il est passé ou sous silence ou dans les notes. C'est par un doute que commence cette aventure, un doute exprimé comme une incise dans le commentaire de Jacopo Berengario da Carpi, au commentaire de Mondino de Luzzi, au texte d'autorité de Galien. Dans ce texte d'autorité, qui est résumé ici de façon caricaturale par Berengario, on définit l'homme et la femme euh, l'un par rapport à l'autre. L'homme est la forme la plus parfaite de tous les animaux. Ainsi, au regard du corps féminin, le corps masculin est le plus parfait. Et je dois dire que j'avais du mal à comprendre ce qu'on peut être plus parfait que parfait, mais nous avons un temps en français pour nous le dire. Le plus que parfait. La cause de cette perfection est l'excellence de sa chaleur. En effet, le premier outil de la nature est la chaleur. Merci, on avait compris. Ainsi, nécessairement, les créatures qui en manquent sont imparfaites. Le raisonnement est imparable. Il n'y a donc rien d'étonnant à ce que le corps féminin soit moins parfait que le corps masculin, d'autant qu'il est plus froid. Aussi, à l'endroit des parties génitales, la femme est moins parfaite que l'homme. Ce doute, en fait allusion à ce corps non queue ni tête de la femme, qui est celui de la théorie ancienne de l'introversion ou rétroversion féminine. Il se résume par une phrase: «La femme porte à l'intérieur ce que l'homme porte à l'extérieur», phrase qu'on trouve, extrêmement souvent, et qui n'exprime pas une symétrie, mais une infériorité de la femme par rapport à l'homme. Dérogation à l'ordre de la nature, le corps féminin est donc défini comme un manque, une incomplétude, eu un inaccomplissement, il n'a pas de forme, pour parler comme Aristote, et Thomas d'Aquin résume ainsi que la femme est un homme occasionné, c'est-à-dire un homme qui a eu un accident. Réduit à l'utérus, qu'on appelle alors la matrice et qui comprend tous les organes féminins, ce corps schématique se définit aussi dans la temporalité de l'attente, attente du remplissage, soit par l'homme, soit par l'enfant à venir. Sa seule justification lorsque on le présente de façon théorique dans les traités d'anatomie est la reproduction. De plus, il est changeant. L'utérus grandit et rétrécit. Il échappe à l'observation puisqu'il est intérieur. Il n'a pas d'identité. La nuance de Berengario qui m'a intéressée et suit le passage que je vous ai donné et commence ainsi. Nota tamen, c'est-à-dire note cependant une petite chose. Avicenne et Galien, les grandes autorités, affirment que les parties de la génération sont les mêmes que chez les hommes et les femmes, qu'elles ne diffèrent que dans le fait que chez les unes, elles sont à l'intérieur et chez les autres, elles sont à l'extérieur. Mais justement, de ce fait, il n'est pas tout à fait vrai qu'elles seraient semblables, sans aucune différence. Si les parties masculines étaient retroussées à l'intérieur et que réciproquement, les parties féminines étaient retournées à l'extérieur. C'est ce nuance, ce cependant, et surtout cette formule, il n'est pas tout à fait vrai, qui lance la grande aventure, un programme scientifique, en fait. Disséquer, observer, comparer les anatomies de femmes et d'hommes, l'anatomie féminine, moins connue alors et moins facilement accessible, devient l'emblème et le trophée de ce nouveau savoir appelé anatomie sensible par Berengario, nouveau savoir sur ce qui était resté obscur et caché. On voit bien comment cet objet représente l'entreprise anatomique et aussi la révolution médicale qui s'effectue alors. Charles Étienne, dont nous reparlerons, dans la dissection des parties du corps humain qu'il publie d'abord en latin en 1545, puis en français en 1546, suit le programme de Berengario da Carpi. Et son troisième et dernier livre, dans cet ouvrage monumental, un immense in-folio avec plus de 60 gravures en pleine page, son troisième et dernier livre commence donc par la femme. Il s'agit pour Étienne d'expliquer par figure tout ce qui est dans le corps de la femme, outre ce qui se trouve en l'homme. C'est ce outre sur lequel je voudrais m'arrêter avant de passer la parole à Soph. Outre, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'y aurait plus cette symétrie. La femme porterait à l'intérieur quelque chose de plus, quelque chose donc de plus accompli que ce qui est dans le corps de l'homme. La perspective de Charles Étienne est double. D'abord, bien sûr, le savoir anatomique, mais aussi, d'une certaine façon, la défense des femmes. À la suite de cette image, sur laquelle nous reviendrons, car pour Charles Étienne, il s'agit bien d'établir que cette image est montrée pour l'honnêteté et non pour la lasciveté du lecteur. Donc, à la suite de cette image, Charles Étienne donne une longue justification du projet de montrer le sexe féminin. Et cette justification est le savoir, mais aussi la compassion. En effet, selon lui, le vulgaire de nos chirurgiens manque de l'entière connaissance de ses organes, ce qui n'est pas sans grand danger pour le corps qu'ils traitent, quand par leur ignorance, ils ne peuvent discerner le col de la vessie d'avec celui de la matrice. Lesquelles choses quiconque a vouloir de mépriser, celui-là, me semble, plutôt mériter le nom écorcheur que de chirurgien. Je m'arrêterai là. Ce sont les derniers mots de Charles Étienne sur la femme. Il passe ensuite à l'excellence de l'œil, puis au cœur et au cerveau. Je m'arrêterai là pour passer maintenant la parole à Soph Duncran, qui va nous parler de ce outre ce qui est le corps de la femme. Sauf a obtenu une bourse de recherche pour les étudiants en premier cycle et qu'elle a consacrée à l'élaboration d'un poster qu'elle a partagé. Et je vais la laisser présenter en quelques minutes sa recherche.
All right. So hello, everybody. I'm Softan Kronen. I'm a medieval studies undergraduate at UVic, and I created this project for UVic's J. Fair under the supervision of Hélène. It's called Finding a Ditch, He Wanted to Cross Over It, Sex Change Stories in Paris, Monsters and Marvels. And the project explores gender ambiguity in early modern France and compares the sex change story of Marie Germain to the then popular figure of the intersex person, who were called hermaphrodites in this period. Marie Germain's story was published in Ambroise Paré's Monsters and Marvels in 1573. And in the story, having held to be a girl, Marie Germain jumps over a ditch and after landing discovers she has developed a penis. And after being confirmed by doctors as a man, Marie is christened with a new name and given men's clothing. Just to give a bit of background, which Ellen has already done, but France from the 16th to 17th centuries was at an intersection of crises. There was the invasion of the Americas, the wars of religion from 1562 to 98, and a crisis of succession in 1574 when Charles IX died. So national identities and categories of difference were a point of interest and anxiety. The old world and the new, Protestant and Catholic, and male and female. Images and texts about so-called monsters, such as hermaphrodites, proliferated. Along with Paré's Monsters and Marvels, important texts included Gaspard Bauen's De Hermaphroditum in 1600 and Jacques Duval's De Hermaphrodite et Couchement des Femmes in 1612. The figure of the hermaphrodite was much more popular than the sex change story, and I was interested in why this was, as it seems like an inverse of our current discourse about trans and intersex people. So firstly, the hermaphrodite was much more easily categorized and incorporated into a self-other dichotomy, and although they were different, they were stable. And we can see this in Paré's chapter on hermaphrodites, in which he categorizes them into 4 distinct types. So they were much more easily turned into monsters. And they were also politically useful, as seen in the pamphlets that were distributed, which depicted Henry III as a hermaphrodite in an attempt to delegitimize his rule. The case of Marie Germain, on the other hand, is necessarily a story rather than a type, and sex change stories reveal the dangerous instability of categories rather than upholding them. One of Paré's goals in depicting the story seems to be to explain why the story is not a threat to stable categories by freezing Marie Germain into a single sex. He implies that Marie was always male and says that Marie was only held to be a girl and uses he, him pronouns for Marie throughout the story. In his explanation of the events, he stresses the unidirectionality of the change. And although he admits a change may have happened, Marie is now permanently a man. So the focus on the hermaphrodite figure over the sex change story reflects the political need for stable self-other categories and reveals the influence of politics on medical texts in this period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Soph, and thank you for presenting today. Yeah, this is a first talk for Soph, and I'm very happy that you could come. Please stay with us because we may have some questions for you. The second team member who is presenting today is Sarah McCormick, and I was cruel enough to ask her to work on others' stinks and other disgusting things written about women in medical texts. She has worked on the stink of misogyny, and she provided us with a movie for her presentation. So let me know if there is any problem with the chat when I start the movie. Sarah, I know you're here, and I thank you very much for this.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah and I'm a fourth year anthropology major and medieval studies minor here at UVic. Last summer I worked on a directed studies project with Helene where we looked at the emergence of scent as a medical problem in 12th and 13th century gynecological literature. The focus of the project was to look at cosmetic recipes in the gynecological text, the Trotula, which was compiled in Salerno, Italy, sometime in the 12th and 13th centuries. I also examined contemporaneous religious and satirical literature in order to add cultural context to the moral expectations and gender construction of women at that time. What I found is that the medicalization of scent shows up in the gynecological literature as part of a new practical approach to medicine at that time, one that includes more local oral traditions such as cosmetic recipes and empirical remedies, something that Monica Green has written extensively on. These recipes provide a glimpse into local practices at the time. It is among these that we find the scent of women defined as a medical problem. I have included quotes from the text, which are quite graphic, so I will let you scan them on your own. These recipes suggest that the severe odor of women's bodies is troublesome to men and therefore must be addressed. Some of the remedies have been attributed to the oral traditions of Muslim women and indicate a cultural exchange between Muslim and Christian women at that time. Yet with later translations, the recipes seem to take on the attitude of the clerical men that are transcribing them. For example, as I worked my way through subsequent vernacular translations of the Trotula, the sections addressing smell took on a more misogynistic tone, with women being referred to as evil-smelling, suggesting a more moral lens than medical. The escalation of patriarchal attitudes is highly evident in the 14th century work of a follower of Albertus Magnus, where the scent of a menstruating woman is not just unpleasant, but dangerous and can corrupt a man's insides. I also compared the medical text to religious literature. Here, much like the monastic translations, I found smell was commonly used to reinforce social expectations on how women should behave. The Ancrine Weiss, a 13th century guide for anchoresses, describes the lustful nature of women as a stink that scatters and blows and can infect those nearby, while Hildegard of Bingen utilizes sweet smells to define a submissive and virtuous feminine ideal. Lastly, I also looked at the satirical literary tradition, which extends back to the ancient world and often stereotypes older independent women as foul-smelling, deviant, and lustful. I found Rustico Filippi's poetry useful as it was composed in Italian vernacular, and while the characterizations are very exaggerated, I think his work provides some cultural context to local Italian attitudes towards women during the 13th century. Rustico's characterizations of women connect the female body with death. You open your mouth, and out comes the reek of 1,000 tombs. As well as deception, your body breeds the fox, with the fox being a common allegory for deception in the Middle Ages. As such, with these stereotypes existing in 13th century Italian culture, it is no wonder that the medieval woman sought out the recipes of the Trotula to mediate or conceal their smell. In conclusion, I found that literary characterizations of women use scent to reinforce desired social behavior and the feminine ideal. Yet medieval gynecological literature suggests that all women's bodies possess inherently foul-smelling and problematic qualities that must be mediated medically. The social construct that women's bodies are naturally smelly and need correction persists today. One only needs to look at the multitude of products in any pharmacy that are marketed to making every part of the female body smell better. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It felt as if you were there. I told you about this proverb that the woman wears inside, what the men wear outside. This was a basis for a hierarchy between sexes, and I'm not sure that there were sexes as much as genders already. And for me, that was extremely interesting to question the fact that what we think is the scientific description of biological data is actually already a definition of gender. So how to draw a line? How can we say that gender is a construction, but sex is not? It all became blurry to me. Also, what became interesting is that this series of questions about the female body is exactly contemporary with what we call in French la querelle des femmes, and which is a very important body of texts written like paradoxes, attacks and defenses, questions and answers about what is it to be a woman. Text mainly written by men, of course. And then 2 generations after Berengario, I met 2 fathers with 2 daughters. The first one is Italian. He's called Giovanni Marinello, and he's born, we don't know a lot about him. He's born in Modena and he lives in Venice most of his life. He's active during 30 years and publishes books about medicine and pharmacology and pharmacy. He comments on Hippocrates and obviously knows that, and writes a compilation on gynecology. But his bestseller is a book called the Medical Remedies related to the infirmity and diseases of women. His daughter, Lucrezia Marinella, lives in Venice, and she's she's much better known for her poetry, and most of all, for a treatise called The Nobility and Excellence of Women. To this first couple, I want to join a second couple, father-daughter, Charles Estienne, that you already know, and who writes the dissection of the body parts, the human body parts, but also who translates from Italian the paradoxes, the paradox. And one of the paradox is in favor of women. His daughter, Nicole Estienne, is well known for 2 sets of stances about the women and defending the women, one of them being called The Miseries of the Married Woman. Jean Liébaud, you remember, that's my title, that's the sentence que la femme n'est animal mutile ni imparfait, is the son-in-law of Charles Estienne and the husband of Nicole Estienne. He's also the French and happy translator and adaptator of Giovanni Marinello's books. He is going to adapt the Italian text, saying, by the way, that he translates from the Latin, because that's more showy. And he is adding a lot to the Italian book. In the preface, he starts with the medical compassion for the woman. La condition humaine est misérable, tant est misérable le corps humain qu'il semble que quelque hydre ou malin esprit ait conjuré dès sa naissance l'entière ruine de sa santé et de sa vie. Or, cette misérable condition, sujette à tant de maladies, est plus à déplorer au corps de la femme qu'en celui de l'homme. Je saute un peu. Le bonheur de la femme serait peut-être de souhaiter ne point naître ou soudain après sa naissance mourir. Cette compassion est développé non pas à cause de la faiblesse du corps de la femme, mais dans les chapitres qui suivent, par l'ignorance des médecins et le refus d'entendre cette douleur. Ce nouveau regard sur le corps féminin, un regard non pas sur la vacuité ni sur la reproduction, mais sur la complexité et l'ignorance affichée à propos de ce corps, ce regard à tâtons lui a donné une altérité, outre ce qui est au corps de l'homme, mais aussi des questions sur les images. Comment montrer, à qui montrer et quoi montrer. Des questions sur la domination masculine également, qui figuraient déjà dans la querelle des femmes, mais qui s'introduisent dans le discours des médecins. Ce regard relève du genre et pose la question des données premières, de l'observation, du fait biologique. Il est néanmoins détourné, ce regard, détourné par la censure, par la décence, par la notion de bienséance qui s'installe. Il est tronqué, on ne présente pas l'appareil génital dans le corps de la femme dans son entier, le plus souvent. C'est ce que Charles Estienne essaiera de faire à la suite de Berengario da Carpi. Mais surtout, c'est un regard qui traverse la cohérence du corps et qui sépare le corps en oubliant le sujet. Ce regard se perpétue et ce que j'ai appelé les révolutions de la visibilité dans l'exposition que nous vous proposons, donc ces révolutions nous permettent de définir autrement le sexe féminin. D'abord, par des technologies nouvelles qui permettent de voir l'intérieur du corps ou de reproduire les 3 dimensions, mais surtout par les différents retournements des regards passés. D'abord, retournement du regard sur le regard des autres, dans le refus d'être des poupées de la seconde vague des féministes, en particulier en France. Le regard sur soi d'un sujet féminin, avec le mouvement d'autogynécologie des années 70. C'est un regard qui va vers l'identité et vers l'appartenance à soi-même, en dehors du projet de la reproduction. Enfin, le regard imposé, l'exhibition politique de jeunes femmes comme les Pussy Riots ou Femen, qui obligent le regard des autres à se poser sur leur propre corps. Ces images nouvelles clament l'autonomie du sujet féminin et la fierté de ce corps. C'est dans ce sens que je dis que cette visibilité est devenue un geste, un discours, de fait, une performance qui questionne le système des 2 genres. Cette performativité, nous l'avons aussi explorée avec Perfecta. La dernière de nos rencontres qui devait avoir lieu, comme vous le voyez, le 23 mars, et vous savez dans quelles conditions elle n'a pas eu lieu. Donc, la dernière de nos rencontres était à la bibliothèque, ou aurait dû être à la bibliothèque, grâce à l'invitation et au soutien de Matt Ukulak, que je ne remercierai jamais assez, notre bibliothécaire Digital Scholarship à l'Université de Victoria et à notre projet commun. Matt, je te passe la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Hélène. I'm just here to say what a wonderful opportunity it has been to work with Hélène. From the library's perspective, we've created a grants menu that allows us to partner with important projects like Hélène. But from the very beginning, there was a question around how can we truly collaborate with humanists in the Digital Scholarship Commons, where we run 3D printers, teach programming, etc. And Hélène provided a beautiful way of collaboration, and that was through the political act of 3D printing a clitoris. I would like to thank my colleagues here. Danny Johnson, who I believe is in this group, was an important collaborator in this. But when Hélène came to us and said, how do we represent something that is hidden? The 3D printer became a tool to be able to do that. And I have to say, it's the first time in my email where I've had to ask questions like, where are the clitorises and how many are we printing? I do want to note a couple things about the 3D print. Someone publicly made a 3D printed clitoris available to the public. And I think Chantal alluded to that in her presentation. This type of collaborative work, which is made possible through the internet and network libraries and groups across the world, helped contribute to this greater knowledge creation. I first met Hélène through book history and teaching, and we tend to think of libraries as places for these old books, special collections, but perhaps less so as places for technological information that's becoming more important for us in our work and our project. So if I don't know if we can see the picture of the clitorises on the screen, but you will note there are a few things that were discussed here. One, you'll see the 3D file on the left, which you can turn and rotate. But on the right, you see a number of these that were printed. This photo was taken by Danny Johnson, who oversaw the printing of this project. The color. Normally we'd print something in a gray, because usually it's engineers who are 3D printing things. But here, I think we really tried to capture the colors of the Pride flag and being able to hand out clitorises to various parties when they came in to actually hold something that personally I had never seen the full contour of. So I just want to thank Hélène for her undying support of the library, her willingness to collaborate with the library and its various support units. And it's been an absolute pleasure of participating. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Danny Johnson, because you have to imagine that each little clitoris takes something like 1 hour to be printed, tuk, with the plastic. And thank you also for the fun it has been. I must say that it was wonderful to meet my VP research and hand her a clitoris saying, which color do you prefer? And it was also political to say, people would ask me, oh, what are you working on? And I would start telling them that I work on female anatomy, and they would ask me, oh, so you work on pornography? And I would say, not exactly, I'm working on public visibility. And then they would say, you mean pornography? And I would say, no. And I would open my bag and take out my orange clitoris and say, oh, that's what I'm doing. And people wouldn't know. So I would take it, put it in my hand and say, well, this is the only visible part. And now we want to have political visibility about the female body. So thank you so much. Thank you, Danny, for your undefectible support and your patience in printing these 75 clitorises, I think. And I only have one left. So people love them, and they love the colors too.
We can print you more.
Oh, great, great.
I do want to say, just when Hélène did present a clitoris to a colleague, the political shock and conversation ability this object can create is still fascinating, and I think speaks to the importance of your work and discussions that we still need to have as a society and will most likely continue to have for many generations.
Merci, Matt. Without further ado, because I see that with my technology limitations, I've put everyone late, and I apologize. I would like to ask Anthony to talk about our exhibit. So we tried to share images with you, not as a lesson or lecture, but as a way of introducing you to some parts of the treasure we have gathered, and which is a huge Zotero database and a beautiful website. So the first part that you can access easily is this exhibit, which is on the blog of the website and has 12 pages. And Anthony, would you like to talk briefly about that?
Oui,
Oui.
merci Hélène. Merci
I
tout le monde.
would like, okay, and so I would like to present you very briefly. Anthony has been with Perfecta for 2 years. He is a PhD student in cultural, social, and political thought. He's a super good theoretician. He's been twice an intern at the Open Knowledge Practicum at the lab ETCL at the library. And he's also an extraordinary burper. I didn't know that for a long time, but these burps are crucial for the last part of the morning.
And now I will have to put burping as a line on my CV as part of my unique expertise. So thank you very much for that. Et merci tout le monde pour être ici. C'est mon plaisir à vous présenter. Et je vais vous adresser en anglais parce que vous ne voulez vraiment pas souffrir mon français. Donc, so as Hélène has told you, I've been a part of the Perfecta project since the summer of 2019. And we were very lucky to receive a couple of fellowships at the Electronic and Textual and Cultural Lab in the UVic Library, the Open Knowledge Practicum, which Hélène has mentioned to you. So this practicum was very helpful, as Matt spoke to as well, in terms of synthesizing our expertise in the humanities, the research questions that we were interested in, with all of the tools that digital humanities research makes possible. So coming into this project, I and others on the team didn't necessarily have much familiarity navigating gargantuan Zotero databases, pulling material from all different databases and resources around the world, such as the medical libraries in France to the national medical libraries in the United States. So this project, from its original conception through to its execution, I think was in a very real way made possible by the kinds of tools and implements and the help that we were able to receive from those at the ETCL and in the OKP, the Open Knowledge Practicum Fellowship. I certainly learned a lot in my experience there about digital humanities research in general. I will just say briefly as well that in terms of our method setting up this project, it was important for us not to set out with a kind of pre-established narrative in mind and then finding images that would more or less fit with this narrative that we had prescribed and then imposing that narrative on the images. The tools that were offered by the digital humanities research, by the ETCL, really helped us build a very large database of images and then go about constructing our narrative in a more kind of scientific way. That is, by sifting through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of images that span centuries and letting the narrative develop organically from these materials on the sexual anatomy of women that we were able to find there. And so when I was originally taken on and started working with the Perfecta team in 2019, evidently our expectations then were a little bit different for what the project would eventually culminate in. We always knew that we wanted to build a website online, a kind of gallery exposition that you would be able to see. And this exists online now, I'm very proud to say. But also evidently the original intent was to have, as you all know, a conference in person, and we know what is responsible for interrupting that as well. So our expectations had to adapt not only to the materials that we were engaging with, but also to the changing situation and the sorts of narratives that were coming out of the images that we were discovering. We finally settled upon 12 different pages in our narrative arc, which you will see up there on the exposition page as well. This, again, grew quite organically from the selection of images that we stored in our database. I think the original conception was slated to only have 3 or 4 sections, so it grew a lot as a result of our collaborative
Yeah.
work and the experiences that we had in the laboratory. Yeah,
And
perhaps I'll
that's
just...
where I come in to
Yes.
thank you, Anthony, to thank, of course, ETCL, but to thank you for the way we collaborated for finding, but also for keeping or not keeping the images. There were some images that I found so disgusting that I would say, no, not this one. And Anthony would say, yeah, but it's interesting, you know. And he was interested in cruelty too. And that I couldn't stand it. But now you've taught me so much. Olga Zeminova was also there. So please go and peruse as you like this exhibit in 12 pages. This is only a very small amount of the images we have collected. And David Douglas was our webmaster. He was collecting everything with method, with structure, and also with a vision, which was a perennial website, not my little blog-like website. David Douglas is a student with many specialties. He is a lettres classiques. He works in Greek and Roman studies. He has a master's. He wrote a beautiful analysis of Virgil's apocryph or dubious pieces and Virgil use of literary genres. He speaks all the languages I would like to speak and read. And when he doesn't speak a language, he learns it. And he also speaks computer language. And so he has designed the Perfect Hour perennial website, which is documentary. And David, please take the floor.
Hello, and thank you for that very flattering introduction, which I'm sure I will not, do not deserve, but
So you do, the kick.
So I'm just going to, I will present myself briefly. I'm David Douglas. I've been working with Hélène now for since 2018 officially, although we've known each other for longer than that. And in that time, I've done a variety of things for Perfecta, but the one project which I'm here to present to you today is the website that we've been building. Can you hear me? There's no problem with the sound.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm showing your website, or you,
yeah, so we're going to do a quick walkthrough, and Hélène, you're going to display it on your screen, and then I'll explain.
Yes, I'm going there, and I'm going to the welcome page.
Great. So this is a, hold on one second. So this is a site that was initially conceived and will hopefully live up to that vision, but initially conceived as a portal which would present in a digital format all of the central sources on which the research of the Perfecta project is based. And we started off with a kind of twofold division between the classical, the antique sources that were most important in forming the tradition of medical knowledge as it was known initially to Renaissance humanists and doctors. So a division between those antique sources and the more the modern works of those scholars. So that's what you see here in the division of pages between text classique and text 16e, 17e. And so, Hélène, if you want to just navigate.
Yeah, I did it.
So, for those of you familiar with the authors of classical antiquity, there will be some, well, familiar names here. And what we did was to look through some various secondary sources as well as primary documents to find which were the passages from mainly Greek authors cited most frequently, either in Greek or in Latin translation, by doctors and students of anatomy during the 16th and the 17th centuries, and to compile them into this list that you see here. So the first job was to make a list of citations, and what you see here is actually not fully complete for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. But so having done that, the challenge then was to find a way to make these passages accessible in an easily navigable format on the site. So as you see, the passages are in drop-down boxes with Greek on one side and French on the other. And this is designed to give the user of the site a kind of synopsis of the tradition that many of the Renaissance authors that we deal with were working with.
Okay.
So now
Texts.
we'll move to the next section. Now the idea here is to do something similar, but with a very different kind of source material, which is to say, instead of dealing with manuscript traditions of ancient Greek works, we're now dealing with modern printed books. And thankfully, thanks to the wonders of modern of 21st century technology, we are able to access large digital collections of these books, and to which are mostly in the public domain, and to represent them on our site. So that's what we have here. Hélène, could you just go back to the list?
Yeah, I go back to the list coming. And do we go to images?
Oh, we're probably running out of time, are we? Okay, well, so it's pretty straightforward, and there are some filters at the top, and Hélène has just showed you that there are dedicated pages for each book with the relevant bibliographical information. All right, so the next stage in the work was to do, again, something similar for images, and many of these images have come from the texts that were just displayed in the previous list. So what we have here are plates and illustrations, diagrams, and things like that that illustrate the arguments and the descriptions which are given in various languages in the other sources. And these, where possible, are cross-referenced with those texts. So if you find one, and there, well, you can expand them. But if you find one, so Hélène, if you find one, see, you could probably click on the title of the work that it comes from, and be taken to the page. Well, if the page exists. So for this one, we don't have a.
Okay, sorry.
But well, not all of them. So not all of the images are connected to a book that's also on the site. In any case, as you can see, it's a bit of a work in progress, but we are moving along. One of the most difficult things is to try and get a standard naming scheme for all of these works and images, so that they can be related to each other inside the kind of the database. anyway, so that's roughly what we've got so far, and what we're aiming at is to well, for one thing, a more complete site, and then a more integrated site where from looking at an image you could transition to looking at the book where that image comes from, or if you're looking at a book, you can access particular passages of interest, and we hope to have some other people working on collecting those passages of interest in the future. We're very happy to be collaborating with the Humanities Computing and Media Center at UVic.
Yeah, HCMC.
Forgive me because the acronym is is normally how I refer to it. HCMC at UVic. Our site administrator, Stuart Arneal, has been very helpful and accommodating, so I'd like to thank him especially, as well as the people at the Bibliothèque Interuniversitaire Santé in Paris, the inter-universitary library of health.
That's okay. That's okay.
And they've been very accommodating as well, allowing us access to their collections. And we are working with them to transition or to replicate the results of our bibliographical work on their site, integrated with their online library of medicine, their catalog, and they have a bit of an encyclopedia that they're building. So we're happy to do that with them, and appreciative of their support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. This is a wonderful work. I want to say that this website is in construction, but already has a lot of documentation, and that everything is accessible. And that was the idea, to put it there. I also want to say that the Bibliothèque Interuniversitaire de Santé is planning to help us, and with the guidance of Jacqueline Vons, who will be speaking 2 days from now, arranging this portal into something that would be gynecology before gynecology. So tota mulier in utero. The woman is, all of the woman is in the uterus. Do you have questions for us before we say goodbye and see you tomorrow? No? So without keeping you longer, I first thank you for being there. I thank you for your presence, and I come to the last part of our morning. Good thing that I wrote 10:30 maybe. It was a pandemic. It was isolation, and we were working as a team. And I was also trying to write a paper on Les Serrés, de Guillaume Boucher. And Les Serrés are a series of evenings. That's the translation of after dinner talk. So that's a series of evenings between friends. They go to one of them. I think that this person is actually represented as a double of the physician. And they drink. And when they are completely drunk, they talk about what people are talking about in France after 1570. So a time full of religious wars and religious conflict. We adapted the third chapter of this book, and we called it De nuit, toute femme son femme toucha son gris. And this is what we propose to share with you. Je vous propose de vous rendre